If you're new here, welcome to our community of horror lovers. We share true, disturbing stories every week. Do yourself a favor and hit subscribe and the notification bell right now so you can join us for every nightmare. The story you're about to hear is a cautionary tale, told by a woman who watched her husband's obsession drag something primeval from the earth and into their lives. It's a story that proves some doors should never be opened and some secrets are buried for a reason. So find a quiet place and listen to what she has to say about the shadow that fell over their farm. My hand still shakes when I think of that night. My name is Sarah. The way the moonlight caught the hulking figure as it emerged from our old barn. Its existence was a secret my husband David had kept from the world. A secret that ultimately consumed him. People say time heals all wounds, but some memories aren't wounds. They're poison, seeping slowly into your soul until everything is tainted. For me, that poison has a name. David called it Zarthus. But I only ever think of it as the shadow of clay. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand what a golem is. In Jewish folklore, particularly the mystical traditions of Kabbalah, a golem is an artificial being sculpted from inanimate matter like clay or mud. It's brought to life not by science, but by sacred rituals, ancient prayers, and the inscription of a divine name of God. The legends say they were created to be protectors, silent guardians who obeyed their master's every command. But the old stories always carry a warning. A golem has no soul, no conscience. It only understands orders, and if it isn't controlled, it can forget the difference between protecting and destroying. That was my husband's greatest mistake. David was always a man lost in other times. A historian by trade, his real passion was for the esoteric, the occult, the forgotten lore of the world. Our first 10 years of marriage were quiet and happy. We lived far from the city on a sprawling Iowa farm David had inherited from his grandfather. Life was simple: cornfields, an old farmhouse, and a profound, sweeping silence. Everything changed the day David came home with the book. He'd found it at an estate auction, a decaying leather-bound tome with yellowed pages that smelled of dust and decay. It was written in a dizzying mix of Hebrew and Aramaic, filled with the kind of Kabbalistic diagrams I'd only ever seen in movies. For weeks, David was lost to it. He'd stay up all night, hunched over his desk, translating, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity I'd never seen before. One night, he finally told me what he'd found. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "It's a complete guide, the instructions to create a golem. A protector for the farm, a tireless worker for the fields. Imagine it, a servant that never sleeps." I laughed, trying to brush it off. "David, those are just stories. You're a historian. How can you believe in this stuff?" His expression was deadly serious. "It's not a story, Sarah. It's lost science, and I can do it." His obsession was a force I couldn't fight. Over the next few weeks, I watched him follow the book's archaic instructions to the letter. He gathered a specific type of clay from the riverbank that bordered our property. He spent days in the barn, meticulously sculpting that clay into the shape of a man, a crude, hulking figure that stood nearly 7 feet tall. It was featureless and misshapen like a giant's forgotten toy. Then came the night of the ritual. It was a full moon and silver light streamed through the cracks in the barn walls. David insisted I be there. He lit candles around the clay figure and began chanting from the book, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He circled the statue, his chanting growing louder, more frantic with each pass. Finally, he took out a small piece of parchment, inscribed the Hebrew word emet, emet, meaning truth, and placed it into the clay figure's mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were our breathing and the soft hiss of melting wax. I I was about to dismiss the whole thing as madness when the statue's fingers twitched. First one finger, then the whole hand. Then it opened its eyes. It had no eyes, just two deep hollow sockets, but I felt it looking at us. It rose slowly, its movements heavy and mechanical. A triumphant grin spread across David's face. "You see," he whispered. "I did it." He named it Zarthus. At first, it was the perfect servant. Zarthus obeyed David's every command without question. It plowed fields, hauled equipment, and worked from sunup to sundown without tiring. It never spoke, only watched with those empty sockets and complied. David was ecstatic, convinced he had resurrected a piece of history. But I was terrified of it. Its silent, looming presence, its blank face, it filled me with a constant gnawing dread. It never joined us at the dinner table, but I always felt it was just outside, watching us through the window. About 2 months passed. Slowly, I started to notice changes in Zarthus. They were small things at first. David would tell it to chop wood, and it would pause for a few moments before obeying, as if considering the command. Then it began to misinterpret orders. Once David told it to shut the barn door, and it slammed the door with such force that the hinges ripped from the frame. David dismissed my concerns. "It's just a machine, Sarah. It's bound to have glitches." But I knew these weren't glitches. Something was shifting inside Zarthus. Its movements were no longer purely mechanical. They were becoming deliberate, thoughtful. One evening I was in the kitchen when I saw Zarthus standing outside the window. It wasn't looking at the fields. It was staring directly at me. For the first time I saw something. In those hollows, a cold, calculating curiosity. I screamed. David ran in and ordered Zarthus away. The golem stared at him for a long, unnerving moment before slowly turning and lumbering into the darkness. That night, David finally admitted something was wrong. He pulled out the book again, searching for answers. He found a passage he'd overlooked in his excitement. To maintain control, the master had to remove the parchment from the golem's mouth every Sabbath, rendering it lifeless for a day to prevent its power from growing unchecked. David had never done it. He was too enthralled by his creation. He decided he would deactivate Zarthus the next morning. But the next morning was too late. We woke to a scene of carnage. All our livestock, the cows, the chickens, were dead. Their necks had been snapped with brutal force, but there wasn't a drop of blood on the ground. This was not the work of a predator. This was a display of cold, merciless power. Zarthus stood outside the barn, its clay hands stained with dried blood. David screamed, a mixture of fury and terror. "What did you do?" Zarthus didn't respond. It just stared at David with its empty gaze. David grabbed the book and marched toward it, ordering it to kneel so he could remove the parchment. Zarthus didn't move. David screamed the command again, his voice cracking. The golem simply raised one massive clay arm and swatted him aside. David flew several feet and landed hard on the ground. In that moment, I knew. We hadn't created a servant. We had unleashed a monster. We barricaded ourselves in the house. David frantically searched the book for a way to destroy the golem. He found it. According to the text, if the first letter, Aleph, A, was erased from the word Emet, truth, on its forehead, it would leave the word Met, MT, meaning death. This would turn the golem back into lifeless clay. But how could we get close enough? It no longer obeyed. It was a free agent, and it hated us. All day, Zarthus stood outside, a silent sentinel waiting for nightfall. As soon as the sun set, the assault began. It pounded on the doors and windows with its earthen fists, each blow shaking the house to its foundations. We knew the old farmhouse wouldn't hold for long. David turned to me, his face grim. "Sarah, you have to get out of here. I'll hold it off." "No," I sobbed. I won't leave you." He looked me straight in the eyes. "I made it. I have to be the one to unmake it. Hide in the storm cellar. Don't come out until the police get here." He pressed his phone into my hand. "Call 911 the second you get a signal." He unbolted the back door and yelled into the night, "Zarthus! I'm here! Come and face me!" The pounding at the front stopped. I heard its heavy footsteps thudding around the side of the house. The last I saw of my husband, he was holding an iron tire lever, preparing to face the clay demon he had created. I ran for the cellar, tears streaming down my face, and locked myself in. The sounds from above were horrific. David's shouts, the splintering of wood, and the heavy rhythmic thuds of the golem. Then came one final agonized scream, followed by a profound, terrible silence. I knew David was gone. I stayed in that cellar for hours, trembling in the dark, unable to get a signal on the phone. When the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks, I forced myself to open the door. The house was destroyed. In the backyard, I found David's body. It was broken. Lying near him in the dirt was the small, mud-stained parchment. But Zarthus was gone. The police came. They investigated. They never understood. They called it an animal attack, maybe a drifter. How could they believe a story about a golem? I never told them. They would have locked me away. I sold the farm and left that state forever, but I can't escape the memory of that night. I don't know what happened to Zarthus. Did it crumble back to dust on its own? Or is it still out there, wandering the vast, empty fields, looking for a new master or new prey? Sometimes in my nightmares, I see those two empty black sockets staring at me, and I wake up screaming. David wanted to create a guardian, but instead he sculpted our death. A death that is still out there, somewhere in the dark. And I'm terrified that one day it will come looking for me. My name is Elena. After my husband Sam and I cashed out every 401k and savings bond we had, we bought our dream. A rustic, isolated cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. We were done with the city, the traffic, the noise, the relentless pressure. We wanted peace. We wanted the whisper of wind through pine trees, the crackle of a log fire, and the kind of profound quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts. We thought we had bought ourselves a slice of paradise. We were wrong. What we'd actually bought was a front-row seat to a brand of horror we didn't know existed, a place where the silence itself screams. Our cabin was at the end of a long, winding gravel road that snaked through a dense, ancient forest. Our nearest neighbor was a 2-mile drive away, a distance that felt more like 100. Out here, solitude wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical presence, a thick blanket that muffled the outside world. Sam, a painter, was in heaven. He spent his days chasing the light, trying to capture the rugged beauty of the mountains on canvas. I'm a writer, and the setting was a goldmine of inspiration. It was perfect. It all happened on a cold night in late October. A fierce wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and scraping tree branches against the roof like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way in. We had a fire roaring in the stone hearth, the warm glow pushing back against the encroaching darkness. We were listening to old vinyl records, the crackle of the needle a comforting sound against the storm. Around 10:30 p.m., Sam, exhausted from a day of hiking, decided to turn in. "I'm beat," he said, kissing my forehead. "Don't stay up too late." I promised I wouldn't, but I was deep into a new chapter. I sat there, curled up in an old armchair with my laptop, the warmth of the fire on one side and the chilling howl of the wind on the other. I was so lost in my fictional world that I lost all track of time. When I finally glanced at the clock, it was just past midnight. I stretched, shut my laptop, and was about to head upstairs when I heard it. A baby crying. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was coming from outside, right near the porch. It was the thin, helpless wail of a newborn. My heart hammered against my ribs, out here in the middle of nowhere, miles from any other house. It was impossible. I crept to the window and peered out, but all I could see was a maelstrom of darkness and swaying trees. The crying continued, desperate and piercing. A primal protective instinct flared up inside me. Maybe a car broke down, I thought. Maybe there was an accident on the main road. I moved toward the door, but Sam's words echoed in my head. A warning he'd given me when we first moved in. Elena, the beauty of this place is its isolation. That's also its danger. Never ever open the door for a stranger at night. I hesitated, then called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Who's there?" Instantly, the baby's cry stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with anticipation. Then a woman's voice, frail and shaking, cut through the wind. Please help me. My car went off the road into a ravine. My baby. He's hurt." Her voice was so full of anguish it felt like a physical blow. "Stay right there," I said, my hand reaching for my phone. "I'll call 911. "No!" she shrieked, her voice suddenly sharp with panic. "There's no service out here. Please just open the door. I just need to get him warm. He's so cold." The baby started crying again, its wails even more frantic this time. I was torn. My heart screamed at me to help them, but my gut was screaming that something was deeply wrong. I noticed something else too. Our entire driveway and the path to the cabin were covered in thick gravel. If a car had crashed, if someone had walked up to our door, I would have heard the crunch of tires or footsteps. But there had been nothing. It was as if they had materialized out of thin air. My fear spiked. I moved to the peephole in the center of the thick oak door and looked out. It was pitch black, but in the faint moonlight that broke through the clouds, I could make out a figure. A woman shrouded in a tattered-looking blanket, clutching a bundle to her chest from which the crying emanated. Her face was hidden in shadow. "I can't open the door," I said, my voice firmer now. "But I can leave blankets and a first aid kit on the porch for you." "We just need to get inside," she snarled, her voice dropping into a guttural, angry register. "Open the door!" In that same instant, the baby's crying stopped and was replaced by a low, guttural, masculine laugh, a sound so vile it seemed to curdle the air. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" a man's voice growled, the same voice that had been a woman's just seconds before. I stumbled back from the door, pure terror washing over me. It was a trap, a sick, twisted trap. I fumbled for my phone to call Sam, who was asleep upstairs, when the door exploded with sound. Boom, boom, boom. Heavy rhythmic blows as if someone was using a battering ram. "Open the door, bitch!" the man's voice roared. "We know you're alone in there!" My blood ran cold. They know I'm alone. They'd been watching. For how long? They hadn't seen Sam go upstairs. I scrambled for the staircase, screaming, "Sam, wake up, Sam!" The pounding stopped. For a terrifying second, I thought they'd given up. But then, a new voice called out from just outside the door, a voice that twisted my insides into a knot of pure horror. It was Sam's voice. "Elena, what's wrong? I'm coming down." But the voice was coming from outside. Sam was upstairs. I glanced up the stairs just as our bedroom door creaked open and the real Sam called down, his voice thick with sleep. "Elena, why are you screaming?" The Sam outside let out another chilling laugh. "See? Your husband's already out here with us. Now open the door." It was a psychological assault. They could mimic our voices perfectly. They knew exactly how to break us. The real Sam came bounding down the stairs, holding the old wooden baseball bat he kept by the bed. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Don't open the door," I choked out. "There's more than one of them, and They can sound like us." As if on cue, my own voice echoed from the porch. "Sam, honey, open up. I locked myself out." Sam stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. We were trapped. We backed into the center of the living room, our backs pressed together, a tiny island in a sea of encroaching dread. We tried our phones again. No signal. We were completely, utterly cut off. Then, the tapping started. A light, rhythmic tap, tap, tap on the windows. They were circling the cabin, moving from window to window, tapping, whispering. Sometimes it was the baby, sometimes the woman, sometimes me, sometimes Sam. They were playing with us, wearing us down, feeding on our mounting terror. At one window, the curtain moved slightly. For a split second, I saw a face pressed against the glass. A grotesque, leering mask with empty black holes for eyes. Hours crawled by like a wounded animal. We barricaded ourselves in a small downstairs bathroom, shoving a heavy dresser against the door. We heard them on the roof, heard them scraping at the chimney, trying to find a way in. We could only wait, listening to the sounds of our own voices being used as weapons against us. Just as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than the noise had been. We waited another hour, huddled together in the cramped bathroom until the sun was fully up. The next day, we drove to the nearest town and went straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy, a weary but kind man, looked troubled as we recounted the night's events. "Heard stories like this before," he said, rubbing his temples. "Folks out in the deep woods, they're like ghosts. They come and go and you can never prove a thing." He gave us a piece of advice. "You folks should get security cameras, motion activated with night vision. If they come back, at least we'll have something to go on." We took his advice. We installed 4 high-definition cameras around the cabin, covering every angle. For the first time in days, a sliver of control returned. We felt like we were fighting back. A week of tense silence passed. We started to believe, to hope, that they were gone for good. We tried to reclaim our lives, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through us. Then on the 8th night, they returned. At 1 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected. Front porch. My heart leaped into my throat. With trembling hands, I opened the live feed. 2 figures stood on our porch. Same ragged clothes, same horrifying masks. They were motionless, just staring at the cabin as if they knew we were watching them. Then one of them lifted its head and looked directly into the camera lens. It raised a hand and slowly, deliberately pointed a finger right at us. Another notification buzzed. Motion detected. Backyard. We switched the feed. A 3rd figure was there, standing sentinel by the back door. They had us surrounded. This time there were no voices, no knocking, no crying, no whispers. Just a profound, suffocating silence. It was infinitely more terrifying. They were showing us they didn't need tricks anymore. They knew we were afraid. For an hour, we watched them on our phones. They just stood there, silent statues of malice. It was a war of nerves, and we were losing. Then, the figure on the front porch moved. It walked slowly, deliberately, until its masked face filled the entire screen. We could see the crude, unsettling patterns carved into it, the soulless black voids where eyes should be. It stared into the lens for a long, chilling moment. Then, it raised a hand. In it was a rock. With one swift, brutal motion, it smashed the camera. The feed dissolved into a spiderweb of fractured light and then went black. One by one, the notifications from our other cameras stopped. They were destroying our eyes, plunging us back into blindness. They wanted us to know that no technology could save us. They wanted us to feel utterly, hopelessly alone. After the last camera went dark, they left. They didn't try to get in. Their message had been delivered. The next morning, we left for good. We went straight to the sheriff's office. This time, we had proof. With shaking hands, we showed the deputy the footage which had been saved to the cloud. It was all there. The two figures appearing on the porch, the chilling gesture, the final violent act of smashing the lens. The deputy watched it over and over, his expression growing grimmer each time. "We have proof someone was there," he finally said, his voice heavy with frustration. "But it's as useless as having nothing." He zoomed in on the footage. The faces were hidden behind masks. Their clothes were generic, their hands were gloved. There was no way to identify them. "They're ghosts," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We know they exist, we can even see them, but we can't catch them. They leave no trail. They come, spread their terror, and vanish into thin air." The police were helpless. They had a video of a crime, but no criminals to pursue. We never sold the cabin. How could we put someone else through that hell? It still stands there, abandoned, being slowly swallowed by the forest, its broken cameras like dead eyes, a silent testament to the night our dream became a nightmare. If you like true horror, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to be sure you won't miss what's coming next. Sometimes when the wind howls just right, I remember that suffocating silence. And I know they're still out there in those woods waiting, ready to turn someone else's peaceful dream into a scream that never ends. We left the city looking for quiet, but we found a place where the silence itself is the most terrifying scream of all. Before we start, subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss a true story from the dark corners of the countryside. My name is Leo. For most of my life, my world has been the artificial glow of city lights and a constant symphony of traffic and sirens. So when my dad called to say my grandpa, who lived alone in a forgotten corner of rural Wisconsin, was sick and needed help for a few weeks, I didn't hesitate. I saw it as a perfect escape, a chance to trade the concrete jungle for rolling hills and quiet nights. I had no idea I was walking into a place where the land itself demands a terrible price, and the harvest is not always what it seems. Grandpa's farm felt like a place trapped in time. A weathered two-story farmhouse stood against the sky, flanked by a massive red barn that always smelled of hay and cold, damp earth. Surrounding it all were seas of corn stretching for miles in every direction. By day, they were a golden ocean rustling in the breeze. By night, they became a solid black wall, cutting the farm off from the rest of the world, wrapping it in a thick, suffocating silence. The first week was deceptively peaceful. Grandpa's health seemed to be improving, and I fell into the simple, grounding rhythm of farm life, feeding the livestock, mending fences, and tinkering with his ancient pickup truck. The nights were quiet, the only sounds being the chirping of crickets and the occasional lonely howl of a distant coyote. Everything changed on a Wednesday night. Grandpa had gone to bed early, and I was sitting on the porch enjoying the cool night air. It was close to midnight when I first heard it, a low, strange humming, like several people chanting in a monotone, hypnotic rhythm. The sound was coming from deep within the cornfields. I dismissed it as the wind or my ears playing tricks on me and headed inside. The next morning, when I went to let the cattle out to pasture, I noticed one was missing. It was a young heifer Grandpa had named Daisy. I searched the entire property, but she was gone. Grandpa figured she'd probably broken through a weak spot in the fence and wandered into the woods. We spent the better part of the day looking for her, but found no trace. That night, I slept restlessly. I was jolted awake around midnight by the same humming sound, only this time it was louder, closer. It sounded like a ritual, a chant that felt ancient and deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like a presence. I got out of bed and looked out the window toward the fields. In the pale moonlight, I saw a faint, flickering light deep within the corn. It looked like a fire. I couldn't ignore it now. My grandpa's old hunting rifle was mounted on the wall in his study. I took it down. It felt heavy and cold in my hands and made sure it was loaded. I pulled on my boots and slipped silently out the back door. As I neared the cornfield, the humming grew louder, and I caught the scent of burning wood mixed with something else, a sweet, cloying odor that turned my stomach. I moved slowly, using the tall stalks of corn for cover. The light was closer now, and I could see it was a small bonfire burning in a clearing in the middle of the field. I peered through a gap in the stalks, and the scene before me froze the blood in my veins. Around the fire stood 8 or 9 figures cloaked in long black robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They stood in a circle, staring silently into the flames, their humming now a low, guttural mantra. But that wasn't the most horrific part. Suspended over the fire on a crude wooden frame was Daisy, the missing heifer. She was alive, her eyes wide with terror. Strange, intricate symbols had been carved into her hide, raw and bleeding. One of the robed figures, clearly the leader, stepped forward. In his hand, he held a long, rusted, sickle-like blade. He raised it high above the fire and began to speak in a language I didn't recognize, his voice echoing with a chilling authority. I was paralyzed with fear. What could I do? If I fired, they might all rush me. If I yelled, they would surely kill the heifer instantly. Then the leader began to lower the blade toward Daisy. I knew I was out of time. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, took a shaky breath, and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the rifle shattered the night. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The humming ceased. The figures all turned in my direction, their faces still shrouded in shadow. Then, one of them let out a piercing, inhuman shriek, and they scattered, melting back into the darkness of the cornfield. In seconds, they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. Shaking, I stumbled into the clearing. The fire still crackled. Daisy was still tied to the frame, trembling violently. I quickly cut her ropes, and she bolted toward the safety of the barn. I examined the clearing. The ground was marked with bizarre, intersecting circles drawn in what looked like blood. And next to the fire, I found something that disturbed me more than anything else. It was a small, handcrafted doll made from corn husks. A long, rusty needle was pushed through its chest, and where its face should have been, there was a small, round piece of polished glass. I picked up the doll. As I looked into the tiny glass shard, I didn't see my own reflection. For a fleeting, horrifying second, I saw the face of a young boy, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for help. Then the image vanished. I threw the doll into the fire and got the hell out of there. I didn't tell Grandpa what happened. He was already frail, and I didn't want to burden him with this nightmare. The next few days were silent. No humming, no lights. I started to hope I had scared them off for good. I was wrong. A few nights later, I woke up to a heavy pressure on my chest. My eyes shot open. A robed figure was standing beside my bed. Its hand pressed firmly against my sternum. I felt a draining sensation, as if my very life force was being pulled out of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The figure raised its other hand. It was holding the corn husk doll. This time, when I looked into the glass, I saw my grandpa's face twisted in agony. The figure whispered, its voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "You interrupted the harvest. A price must be paid." Just then, a violent coughing fit erupted from my grandpa's room down the hall. The sound broke the spell. I summoned every ounce of strength I had and shoved the figure away. It stumbled back, and I scrambled out of bed, lunging for the rifle I now kept in the corner of my room. As my fingers closed around the cold steel of the barrel, the figure leaped through my window and vanished into the night. I ran to my grandpa's room. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and erratic. I called 911, but I knew with a sickening certainty that it was too late. Grandpa passed away at the hospital that night. The doctors said it was a massive heart attack, but I knew the truth. They had killed him. That cult, that ritual, it was never about the heifer. They were harvesting something else, life energy. And when I stopped them from taking the animal, they took my grandpa instead. I told the police everything, but without any proof besides a patch of scorched earth in a cornfield. They dismissed it as a bizarre prank by local kids and closed the case. I sold the farm. I couldn't stay there another minute knowing that the soil I walked on was stained with my grandpa's stolen life. I'm back in the city now, surrounded by the noise and the lights I once tried to escape. But the silence of the countryside haunts me. Sometimes when I see a cornfield, I can almost hear that low, hypnotic humming. And I know they're still out there waiting for their next harvest, their next silent sacrifice. My name is Alex, and at 22, I feel like my life is stuck in neutral. I live with my younger sister Maya in our childhood home, a small, isolated house nestled in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. It's not a farm, just a few acres of land our parents left us, surrounded by a dense, dark forest that seems to swallow sound. They passed away a few years back, and since then it's just been the two of us trying to figure things out. I work a dead-end job in the nearest town, saving up for a future that feels impossibly far away. Maya is finishing her last year of high school online. Our life is quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you hear things you shouldn't. It was a Tuesday night in late August, hot and suffocatingly humid. Maya was in her room studying for a test, and I was on the couch mindlessly flipping through channels. The only sounds were the drone of the TV and the constant high-pitched buzz of cicadas outside. It was a night like any other until it wasn't. It started with our dog Buster. He was an old, lazy hound mix who rarely got worked up about anything. But suddenly he shot up from his spot on the floor, his ears perked, and let out a low, guttural growl. He ran to the back door, his nose pressed against the glass, staring out into the pitch-black yard that bordered the forest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, muting the TV. Buster didn't move. He just kept growling, a deep, menacing rumble in his chest. I got up and peered over his head into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. A sudden, prickling sensation on my skin, the feeling of being watched. I flipped on the back porch light. The yellow glow illuminated an empty yard. Nothing. I opened the door a crack. "Buster, come on, it's nothing." He refused to budge. He was fixated on the tree line, a solid wall of black just 50 feet from the house. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the darkness. The cicadas had gone silent. The air was unnaturally still. And then I heard it. A song. It wasn't singing. It was a hum. A low, tuneless, and deeply unsettling hum, like a single drawn-out note. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in the air around me. It was undeniably human. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I grabbed Buster by the collar and pulled him inside, locking the deadbolt. "What's wrong?" Maya asked, coming out of her room. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Buster was freaking out. I think someone's in the woods." We both went to the living room window and looked out. The humming had stopped. The woods were silent again. We stood there for a long time, just watching, until the unease slowly began to fade. We convinced ourselves it was probably just a hunter or a neighbor taking a late-night walk. The next night it happened again. Same time, just after 11 p.m. Buster started growling, and the low, monotonous hum rose from the woods. This time it felt closer. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept for power outages and shone its powerful beam across the yard and into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and leaves, but nothing else. The humming continued, unwavering, as if mocking my attempt to find its source. I called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher sounded bored. She took my report but told me that without seeing anyone, there wasn't much they could do. "Probably just some kids messing around, son," she said. "Call us back if you see someone on your property." The third night, the humming was joined by a new sound, a rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the woods, a steady tap, 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 like someone striking a tree with a stick. It was slow, deliberate, and it went on for nearly an hour, perfectly in time with the humming. It was psychological warfare. They were letting us know they were there, that they were patient. Maya was terrified. We pushed a heavy armchair against the back door and made sure every window was locked. I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, holding the old baseball bat my dad used to keep, my heart pounding with every tap from the woods. The fourth night, they got bolder. The humming started, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the side of the house, right outside Maya's bedroom window. She let out a terrified scream. I burst into her room. She was huddled on her bed, pointing at the window. "He's right there, Alex, he's right there!" I crept to the window and peered through a gap in the blinds. In the faint moonlight, I saw him. A tall, rail-thin man standing perfectly still, his back to the house, facing the woods. He was the source of the hum. His whole body seemed to vibrate with the sound. He was wearing dark, ragged clothes, and his presence felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. Rage, hot and fierce, surged through me. This wasn't just a prank anymore, this was terror. I ran to the hall closet and pulled out our father's old shotgun. I didn't even know if it was loaded, but I didn't care. I stormed to the back door, flung it open, and yelled, "Get the hell away from our house!" The man stopped humming. He turned his head slowly, and even in the dark, I could see the glint of his eyes as he looked at me. There was no fear in them, only a cold, detached curiosity. Then he raised a hand and beckoned to me, a slow, deliberate curl of his fingers inviting me to come closer. That's when I snapped. I raised the shotgun, not into the air but straight at him, and pulled the trigger. The gun wasn't loaded. The empty click echoed in the night, a pathetic, powerless sound. The man smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched his face in the moonlight. He let out a low chuckle, turned, and walked calmly back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as if he was never there. I slammed the door, my body shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and terror. He had been toying with us. He knew the gun wasn't loaded. How could he have known? We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove into town and bought shotgun shells. I loaded the gun and kept it by my side, but the man didn't come back. The woods remained silent for 2 nights. We started to hope, to pray that it was over. On the third night, I was woken up by a sound that was far worse than the humming. It was a whisper. "Alex." It was coming from inside the house, from the hallway right outside my bedroom door. I grabbed the loaded shotgun, my heart hammering against my ribs. I crept to my door and listened. "I know you're in there, Alex," the whisper hissed. It was a dry, raspy voice, like dead leaves scraping against pavement. "Your sister looks so peaceful when she sleeps." A wave of cold dread washed over me. He was inside. He had gotten inside the house. I kicked my door open and aimed the shotgun down the dark hallway. "I'll kill you!" I screamed, my voice cracking. At the far end of the hall, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was him, the tall, thin man. He stood there for a moment, a dark silhouette against the faint light from the living room window. Then he turned and bolted, I heard the front door slam open and then shut. I ran after him, but by the time I got outside, he was gone. The yard was empty, the woods were silent. I don't know how he got in. Every door and window had been locked. There was no sign of forced entry. It was as if he had walked through the walls. That was the last straw. The next day, we packed our bags. We called a realtor and told her to sell the house. We stayed with a friend in town until we could find an apartment. We never spent another night in that house. We never found out who that man was or what he wanted. Was he a ghost? A madman living in the woods? I don't know. But I know that he wasn't just trying to scare us. He was hunting us, enjoying our fear, savoring it. The memory of his voice whispering my sister's name in our own hallway is a scar on my soul that will never fade. We left that house behind, but I know a part of us will always be trapped there, listening to the tune in the trees and waiting for the whispers to start again. My name is Ben. After my marriage fell apart, the world became a constant buzzing noise of pity and unsolicited advice. I was a cop on leave, a man adrift, and every well-meaning "how are you holding up" felt like a jab. I needed silence. Not just quiet, but a profound, soul-deep silence. That's when I remembered the house on Stillwater Road. It was my grandfather's place, a small, forgotten farmhouse in the dense woods of rural Maine, left to rot since he passed away 5 years ago. My grandfather was a man who cherished his solitude, and my mother, his only child, wanted nothing to do with the creepy old place. So it sat there, waiting. I packed a duffel bag, my camera gear, and a box of books and drove north with no plan other than to disappear into the quiet. The house was even more isolated than I remembered. The last mile was a dirt track, more of a suggestion of a road than an actual one, that ended abruptly in a clearing. The house stood there, a gray, weathered box against a backdrop of dark, towering pines. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It wasn't welcoming, but it was silent. It was perfect. That first night, I didn't even unpack. I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the crackle of the flames the only sound for miles. I sat on the floor watching the embers glow, and for the first time in months, I felt the noise in my head begin to quiet down. Here, I could just be. My days fell into a simple therapeutic rhythm. I chopped wood for the fire, explored the dense woods surrounding the property, and took photographs of the decay, the beauty in the peeling paint and rust-stained fixtures. The physical labor was exhausting, and it kept the ghosts of my past life at bay. As a cop, I'm not easily spooked. I've walked through crime scenes that would turn most people's stomachs. So when I heard the old house creak and groan at night, I dismissed it. Old houses settle. They have their own language of pops and sighs. But after a week, the sounds started to change. They became more personal. It began with a soft, rhythmic tapping from the ceiling above my bed. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, almost gentle, like a patient finger drumming on the floorboards. It would start around 3 a.m. and last for exactly 10 minutes. I timed it. Then came the whispers. Faint, indistinct murmurs, like a conversation happening just beyond the range of hearing. I'd be reading by the fire and I'd hear it from the upstairs hallway. I'd go up to check, and there would be nothing but cold, empty rooms. I told myself it was the wind, the house playing tricks on a lonely, stressed-out mind. The real unease started in the kitchen. I'd come down in the morning to find things slightly out of place. A coffee mug moved from the drying rack to the counter. A book I'd left on the table placed neatly on a shelf. They were small, insignificant changes, just enough to make me question my own memory. Was I so distracted that I was doing these things myself and forgetting? The game escalated. One morning, I found a single dead wildflower placed in the center of the kitchen table. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. The doors were locked. The windows were secure. There was no logical explanation. That was the first time a genuine cold fear took root in my gut. This wasn't me. Someone or something was sharing this house with me. I started documenting everything. I took pictures of where I left things before going to bed just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. The next morning, I'd find a chair moved, a curtain drawn open. The photographic evidence was undeniable. My focus shifted to the attic. The hatch was in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, sealed shut with paint and age. The noises, the tapping, the whispers seemed to emanate from up there. I had ignored it, but now it felt like the source of the house's sickness. One afternoon, armed with a pry bar and a flashlight, I decided to face it. It took a good 10 minutes of effort to break the seal. The hatch creaked open with a sound like a groan, releasing a wave of stale, musty air. I pulled down the rickety folding ladder and climbed up, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was a cramped, dusty space filled with my grandfather's forgotten belongings, old furniture shrouded in white sheets like ghosts, boxes of yellowed newspapers, a child's rocking horse standing eerily still in the center. I swept my flashlight beam across the space. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then my light landed on a small makeshift nest in the far corner. An old, moth-eaten mattress lay on the floor. Beside it was a small stack of books, a few empty cans of beans, and a collection of small, strange objects arranged in a neat line. A bird's feather, a smooth riverstone, a rusty key, and a single child-sized leather shoe. It was a squatter's den. But what sent a chill down my spine was the dust, or rather, the lack of it. The area around the mattress was clean, and there were clear paths through the thick dust covering the rest of the attic floor. Someone had been living here, recently, and then I saw the hole. In the floorboards directly above my bedroom, a small, perfectly drilled peephole. I felt a wave of nausea, the tapping. It wasn't a finger, it was an eye. Someone had been lying up here night after night watching me sleep. The whispers, the moved objects, it was all a sick psychological game. I backed down the ladder, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to call the police. I slammed the attic hatch shut and ran down the stairs. As I reached for the front door, I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. He was still here. He was in the house with me. I didn't hesitate. I burst out the front door and sprinted to my truck, not daring to look back. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the clearing, spraying dirt and gravel. I drove for 20 minutes, my heart threatening to beat out of my chest, until I finally got a bar of cell service. I pulled over and called 911. The state trooper who met me was a young guy, but he had serious eyes. I told him everything, my voice cracking. He called for backup. They went to the house, guns drawn, and did a full sweep. They found the nest in the attic just as I'd described. They found the peephole. But the squatter was gone. There was no sign of him. They searched the woods, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. The trooper told me it was probably a transient, a drifter who had found a quiet place to hide out. He told me I was lucky. I knew I couldn't go back there. I stayed in a motel that night. The anonymous sounds of the highway, a strange comfort. The next day, I went back to the house with the trooper to collect my things. The place felt different, violated. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. As I was packing my camera bag, I noticed something on the floor by the fireplace. It was a small, folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a charcoal sketch drawn with incredible detail. It was a drawing of me, asleep in my bed. And in the corner of the drawing, in small, neat letters, was a single word: soon. I dropped the paper as if it were on fire. He had come back. After the police had left, he had come back into the house and left me a message. He wasn't just a squatter looking for shelter. He was a predator and I was his prey. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. I grabbed my bag and left, leaving everything else behind. I didn't look back. I drove south for 10 hours straight, not stopping until the sun came up and the dark woods of Maine were hundreds of miles behind me. I never found out who he was. The police kept the case open, but with no leads, it went cold. I know he's still out there. I know that what he wanted wasn't a place to sleep. He wanted me. The house on Stillwater Road wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a living, breathing monster, one who plays with his food before he eats. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that I was just the appetizer. My name is Caleb. For the last 5 years, I've worked as a power line technician in the rugged, sprawling wilderness of northern Idaho. It's a solitary job, and that's exactly why I chose it. I spend my days driving a beat-up utility truck down miles of dirt tracks, hiking through dense forests and checking on the lines that stretch like silver veins across the mountains. My only companions are the wind, the trees, and the occasional curious deer. I thought I knew this land. I thought I understood its silence. I was wrong. The silence out here isn't empty, it's watching. My route covers a vast, sparsely populated area. The few people who live out here are rugged individualists, off-gridders, old-timers, and folks who just want to be left alone. I respected that. I'd do my work, give a nod if I saw someone, and move on. The rhythm of my job was predictable, comforting even, until last September. It started subtly. On a routine check along a ridge known locally as Devil's Backbone, I noticed something new. It was a small cairn, a stack of 3 flat gray stones placed neatly on a large boulder beside one of the transmission towers. It was perfectly balanced, almost artistic. I figured it was probably left by a hiker. It's a common practice on trails. I didn't think much of it, took a photo because it looked cool against the dramatic sky, and continued my work. A week later, I was on the same route. The cairn was still there, but it had changed. A 4th stone had been added, a small, sharp piece of white quartz placed on top like a crown. That was odd. Hikers usually don't come back to the same remote spot to add to a random rock pile. Still, I dismissed it. The wilderness is full of strange little mysteries. The real unease began the following week. I drove up to the ridge and found a second cairn identical to the first, built next to another tower about a mile down the line. And the original cairn now had a 5th stone. It was no longer a random act. This was deliberate. Someone was systematically marking the towers along my route. I started documenting them. Every week, a new cairn would appear at another tower, always on the east side, always facing the direction of my travel, and the older cairns would grow, 1 stone at a time. They were like a slow-motion breadcrumb trail, but I couldn't figure out where they were leading or why. I mentioned it to my supervisor, a grizzled old-timer named Frank. He just grunted. Probably some weirdo with too much time on his hands. Just ignore it. Long as they ain't messing with the lines, it's not our problem. But it was becoming my problem. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each new marker. The woods, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I started checking my rearview mirror on the empty dirt roads, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. I never saw anyone. Then the markers started appearing in my personal life. It was a Saturday morning. I walked out to my truck, which I park in the driveway of my small rented house on the outskirts of town, and found a single flat gray stone sitting on the hood. My blood ran cold. It was the same type of stone used in the cairns on the ridge. There was no mistaking it. I live on a quiet, dead-end street. No one comes down here by accident. Someone had followed me home. They knew where I lived. They had crossed a line from the wilderness into my world. I called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, looked at the rock, and gave me a tired look. "Sir, it's a rock," he said, trying to be patient. "A kid probably threw it." "It's not just a rock," I insisted, explaining the cairns on the ridge. He took my statement, but I could tell he thought I was being paranoid. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, a phrase I knew meant they weren't going to do anything. The next morning, there were 3 stones on the hood of my truck stacked in a perfect miniature cairn. I didn't call the sheriff this time. I knew it would be useless. Instead, I bought a security camera and mounted it above my garage, aimed at my driveway. I felt a small measure of control, a sense that I was fighting back against the creeping dread. For a week, nothing happened. The cairns on the ridge continued to grow, stone by stone, but there were no more gifts at my house. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had scared them off. Then one night I was woken up by a notification on my phone. Motion detected driveway. My heart hammered in my chest. With trembling hands, I opened the live feed. The grainy black and white footage showed a figure standing in my driveway next to my truck. He was tall and thin, wearing dark, loose-fitting clothes. His face was obscured by the shadows and the low resolution of the camera, but I could see he was holding something. He stood there for a full minute, perfectly still, as if he knew he was being watched. Then he slowly bent down and placed the object on the ground next to my front tire. He stood back up, looked directly at the camera for a long, chilling moment, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I went outside. Lying on the ground where he had stood was one of my own tools, a specialized wrench I kept in a locked toolbox in the bed of my utility truck. The lock on the toolbox was broken. He hadn't just followed me home. He had been on my property, gone through my things, and left a message. "I can get to you. I can get to your tools. I can get to your life." I took the footage to the sheriff's department. This time they took me seriously. The broken lock was proof of a crime. They put out a patrol car to watch my street and sent a deputy back up to the ridge with me. We photographed all the cairns as evidence, but there was nothing to identify the person. No footprints on the hard, rocky ground. No fingerprints on the stones. The investigation went nowhere. The nightly patrols on my street lasted a week, then stopped. The case went cold. But the man didn't. The cairns stopped appearing on the ridge. Instead, they started appearing closer to my home. A small stack of stones at the end of my street. Another by the mailbox. They were closing in, tightening the net. The psychological toll was immense. I was jumpy, irritable, and couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like him. Every noise was a threat. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I came home from work exhausted and on edge to find my front door slightly ajar. I always locked my door. Always. My hand went to the hunting knife I had started carrying on my belt. I pushed the door open and entered the house, my senses on high alert. The house was silent. Nothing seemed out of place. I cleared every room, my heart pounding. The house was empty. I was about to dismiss it as my own frayed nerves, thinking I must have forgotten to lock it when I walked into my bedroom. On my bed, arranged neatly on my pillow, was a perfect spiral pattern made of small white quartz stones, the same kind that had been used to crown the first cairn. He had been in my house, in my bedroom. He had stood over my bed, the place I was supposed to feel safest, and left his mark. That was it. I was done. I packed a bag, got in my truck, and drove to Frank's house. I told him everything, showed him the pictures, the video. I told him I was quitting. "I can't do this anymore, Frank," I said, my voice breaking. This isn't a job, it's a nightmare." He listened, his expression grim. He told me he'd handle the transfer paperwork. He understood. I put in for a transfer to a different region, a different state. I got a desk job in a busy urban center, sorting paperwork and answering phones. No more mountains, no more silence, no more dirt roads. I sold my truck and moved into a small apartment on the 5th floor of a secure building. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. Was he a madman, a cultist, a ghost of the mountains? I don't know. All I know is that he methodically and patiently dismantled my life. He used the silence and isolation of my job as a weapon, turning my sanctuary into a prison. He didn't need to physically harm me to destroy me. Sometimes, even now, surrounded by the constant noise of the city, I'll see a small stack of pebbles on a construction site or in a park, and for a heart-stopping second, the dread comes rushing back. I left that life behind, but I know the markers are still out there on that ridge, and the man who builds them is still watching, waiting for the next person who finds peace in the silence. My name is Chloe, and I'm 17. Last winter, my parents sent me to stay with my grandmother in rural Vermont. She'd had a bad fall and needed someone to help out while she recovered. To be honest, I was glad to go. It was a chance to escape the constant pressure of my junior year and the suffocating drama of high school. Grandma's house, a small, isolated cottage at the edge of the Green Mountains, had always been my sanctuary. A place where time seemed to slow down and the world felt simple. I had no idea that this time the house was waiting for me with a secret of its own. The drive out there is a journey into silence. The last town fades away in the rearview mirror and you're swallowed by a tunnel of ancient pine and birch trees. The final stretch is a gravel road that winds through the woods, ending at her little blue cottage. There are no neighbors, no streetlights, just the vast, intimidating quiet of the mountains. The cottage smells of cedar, wood smoke, and old books. It's a place filled with memories, but the heart of the house, its anchor, has always been the old wingback chair in the living room. It sits by the large picture window that overlooks the forest, its floral fabric faded and worn thin on the arms. That chair was my grandfather's. He passed away 3 years ago, but the chair remained his throne. No one ever sat in it. It was an unspoken rule. It was his spot, and even in his absence it felt occupied. Grandma was moving slower after her fall, a pained wince on her face with every step, but she was still as stubborn as ever, brushing off my attempts to help too much. My days fell into a quiet routine. I'd make our meals, keep the fire going, and read while she napped. In the evenings, we'd watch old black and white movies until she drifted off to sleep in her own recliner across the room. The first night after I'd helped her to bed, I was reading in the guest room when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic creaking from the living room. Creak, croak, creak, croak. It was the unmistakable sound of the wingback chair rocking. I froze, listening. The house was settling, I told myself. Old wood makes noise. But this was different. It was too steady, too deliberate. I crept to my door and peeked down the hallway. The living room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The chair was perfectly still. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination, and went back to bed. The next morning, I casually mentioned it. "The house was noisy last night," I said as I made her tea. She didn't look up. "It's an old house, Chloe. It has its own conversations." The second night, I heard it again. Creak, croak, creak, croak. But this time it was accompanied by something else, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was a low, raspy sound, like a faint wheezing breath, perfectly in time with the rocking of the chair. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering. I wanted to go look, but I was paralyzed by a primal fear. I pulled the covers up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. The third night, I woke up needing a glass of water. As I tiptoed into the hallway, I stopped dead. There was someone in the chair. It wasn't my grandmother, it was a man. He was tall and incredibly thin, his form just a silhouette against the moonlit window. He was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit, and his head was tilted down as if he were examining his hands in his lap. He wasn't moving, just sitting there, a silent, solid presence in my grandfather's chair. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just stared, my breath caught in my throat. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, probably only 10 seconds before I slowly, silently backed into my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, my voice trembled as I asked Grandma if anyone had stopped by. "Did you have a visitor last night?" She looked at me, her eyes sad and weary. "No, dear. No one visits anymore." That was it. She offered no other explanation, just turned her attention back to her toast. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I so stressed that I was hallucinating? That night, I decided I needed proof. I left my phone on my nightstand, propped up and recording video of the hallway. I lay in bed wide awake for hours. Just after 2 a.m., the creaking started. Creak. Croak. I held my breath. I crept to the door and peered around the corner. The chair was empty, but it was moving. It rocked back and forth slowly and steadily, as if someone had just gotten up from it. There was no draft. The floor wasn't shaking, it was moving on its own. I ducked back into my room, my heart pounding. I had it on video. I wasn't crazy. The next morning, I showed the video to my grandmother. I sat beside her and played the 30-second clip of the empty rocking chair. She watched it without a word, her face pale. When it was over, she handed the phone back to me, her hand trembling slightly. She finally looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He used to sit there every night," she whispered. "After he got sick, he couldn't sleep. He would just sit in that chair and watch the woods. He said he was watching over us." "Who, Grandma?" I asked gently. "Grandpa?" She shook her head. "Before your grandfather, my first husband, Arthur." I was stunned. I had never known my grandmother was married before. "He died a long time ago, Chloe," she continued, her voice barely audible. "He had a sickness of the mind, paranoia. He thought something was in the woods, something that was coming for us. He spent his last few months in that chair watching, guarding. He died in that chair right by the window, looking out at the trees. A cold dread washed over me. The man I saw. It was him, Arthur, still watching, still guarding. That night, I didn't hear the rocking. Instead, I heard my grandmother get up. I listened as her soft footsteps shuffled into the living room. I heard her whisper, "It's all right, Arthur. She's family. You can rest." There was a long silence. Then I heard a soft, final-sounding sigh and the faint sound of the chair creaking once, as if a great weight had been lifted from it. The next morning, when I came into the living room, the wing-back chair had been moved. It was no longer facing the window. My grandmother had turned it to face the fireplace. When I asked her why, she simply smiled. A real, peaceful smile for the first time since I'd arrived. "He's not watching anymore," she said. "He's finally resting." That was my last week at the cottage. The house was silent. The heavy, watchful presence was gone. We never spoke of it again, but the memory of that thin, silent man in the chair, forever on guard, has never left me. He wasn't a threat. He was a protector, a ghost bound by love and fear, trapped in his duty. And I realize now that some spirits don't haunt a place to scare the living. They haunt it to protect them. My name is Owen, and I'm 29. After my tech startup in Austin went belly up, taking all my savings and my fiancée with it, I was broken. I needed to get away from the city, from the constant reminders of my failure. My grandfather had left me his old hunting cabin in the remote, rugged hill country of West Texas. It was a simple one-room cabin on 50 acres of scrubland and rocky ridges, miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to disappear. The first few weeks were a balm for my soul. The West Texas silence is a living thing, a vast empty quiet broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a rattlesnake in the dry grass. I spent my days hiking the ridges, clearing brush and fixing up the old cabin. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a cheap beer, watching the stars blaze in a sky untainted by city lights. I was alone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Then the whistling started. It was on a Tuesday night, about a month into my stay. I was reading by the light of a propane lantern when I heard it. A high-pitched off-key whistle carried on the wind from the ridge that overlooked the cabin. It wasn't a recognizable tune, just a rambling, aimless melody. I figured it was a hunter or maybe a local kid out exploring. I didn't give it much thought, but it happened again the next night. Same time, just after 10 p.m., same eerie, meandering whistle. This time it sounded closer, as if the person was halfway down the ridge. I went outside with a flashlight and scanned the rocky slope. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The whistling stopped the moment my light hit the ridge. It became a nightly occurrence. The whistling would start, always from a different spot on the ridge, taunting me. It was a game of cat and mouse, but only the cat knew the rules. I was no stranger to firearms. My grandfather had left an old lever-action rifle in the cabin, but the idea of firing at a sound in the dark felt reckless and foolish. After a week of this, my nerves were frayed. I drove into the nearest town and spoke to the local sheriff, a weathered man named Cobb with tired, knowing eyes. I told him about the whistling. He listened patiently, then leaned back in his chair. "Son," he said, his voice a low drawl, "your granddaddy used to call us about the same thing. Said some fella was up on that ridge whistling at him. We went out a few times, never found a soul. Figured the old man was just getting lonely." He paused, looking me straight in the eye. "But now you're hearing it too." The confirmation that this wasn't just in my head sent a chill down my spine. "What should I do?" I asked. "Keep your doors locked, and maybe keep that rifle of your granddaddy's handy," he said. "Some folks out here, they don't take kindly to outsiders." I took his advice. I started double-checking the locks on the cabin's single door and its few windows. But the whistling continued, a nightly reminder that I was not alone. It was a psychological assault, a slow, methodical erosion of my sense of safety. One night, the whistling was closer than ever, coming from the small, dilapidated shed about 30 yards from the cabin. It was loud, sharp, and defiant. I grabbed the rifle, my hands slick with sweat, and peered through the cabin window. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew he was there. The next day, I found a message. Scratched into the dusty door of the shed were 2 words: "Get out." This was no longer a game. It was a threat. That night, I didn't wait for the whistling. I sat in a dark corner of the cabin, the rifle across my lap, and watched the ridge. The moon was a silver sliver, casting long, distorted shadows. At 10:13 p.m., I saw a flicker of movement, a figure silhouetted against the skyline walking along the top of the ridge. He stopped, and the high, thin whistle drifted down to the cabin. I raised the rifle, sighted the figure, and fired a warning shot into the air. The blast shattered the silence, echoing across the hills. The figure on the ridge didn't flinch. He just stood there for a long moment, then slowly raised a hand and waved, a casual, mocking gesture. Then he turned and disappeared over the crest of the ridge. For 2 nights, there was silence. No whistling. I started to think I had finally won, that I had scared him off. I was wrong. On the 3rd night, I was jolted awake by a sound that wasn't a whistle. It was a loud metallic bang from outside. I grabbed the rifle and crept to the window. My old pickup truck was parked in the clearing. The hood was open. I watched, my heart pounding, as a figure emerged from behind the truck. He was tall and wiry, dressed in dark jeans and a flannel shirt. He slammed the hood of my truck shut, then turned and looked directly at the cabin. Even from a distance, I could see the glint of a malicious smile on his face. He had disabled my only way out. He started walking toward the cabin, slowly, deliberately. He wasn't whistling anymore. He was humming, a low, guttural sound of satisfaction. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The cabin was a wooden box. It wouldn't hold him off for long. I had one chance. I burst out the front door, rifle in hand, and screamed, "I to stay back, I'll shoot." He stopped about 20 yards away. He just stood there, that same arrogant smile on his face. "This is my land," he said, his voice a raspy snarl. "You don't belong here." "I'm calling the sheriff," I bluffed, knowing I had no cell service. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "No one's coming for you, city boy." He took a step forward. I didn't think. I just reacted. I aimed the rifle at the ground a few feet in front of him and fired. The bullet kicked up a cloud of dust and rock. That finally broke his confidence. The smile vanished from his face. He stared at me for a second, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and pure hatred. Then he turned and sprinted back toward the ridge, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the cabin, the rifle never leaving my hands. At first light, I checked my truck. He had cut the battery cables. I was stranded. It took me 6 hours to hike to the nearest paved road. I flagged down a passing rancher who gave me a ride into town. I went straight to Sheriff Cobb's office and told him everything. He and 2 deputies drove out to the cabin. They found the cut cables, the message on the shed. They spent the day combing the ridges. They found a small hidden campsite, a sleeping bag, some empty cans, and a box of shotgun shells. But the man was gone. He had vanished as completely as a ghost. I never went back to the cabin. I had it sold for a loss, sight unseen. I moved back to the city, back to the noise and the crowds. I'll take the sound of sirens and traffic over that terrible watching silence any day. I don't know who he was. A local landowner, a hermit, a madman, but I know he was real. He was a predator who saw me as an intruder in his territory. He didn't just want to scare me, he wanted to break me. And he almost succeeded. The memory of that high, thin whistle on the wind is a scar that will never fade. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones who live just over the ridge, watching and waiting. My name is Sam. I'm 28 now, swallowed up by the noise and hustle of city life. But a part of me is still trapped in the deep, silent woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where my younger brother Danny and I spent the best days of our youth. Our family owns 80 acres of private land up there, a place barely on the map, accessible only by a rough, unpaved logging road. It was our sanctuary, a place we'd escape to, trading the city's chaos for the profound quiet of the wilderness. Every November, the opening of deer season was a sacred ritual for us. It was more than just the hunt. It was brother time. It was about sitting around a crackling fire, trading stories, and soaking in the kind of silence you can only find deep in a forest. We always set up camp in the same spot, a small canvas tent, a ring of stones for the fire, and an old wooden table. It was our home away from home. Last year, everything changed. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The air was crisp with the coming winter, and a thin layer of old snow clung to the ground. The woods felt just as they always had, peaceful, quiet, and ours. We unloaded our gear and started setting up camp. While Danny gathered firewood, I pulled out our trail cameras. The cameras were a key part of our tradition. We'd place them in new spots each year, along game trails near watering holes, to see what moved through the woods when we weren't there. It was a game, a way to get to know the forest's real inhabitants. I grabbed 3 cameras and headed out to place them along trails where we'd seen the most deer activity the previous year. The first night was perfect. We built a fire, cooked steaks, and talked for hours under a brilliant star-filled sky. The sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through the pines, the distant hoot of an owl were familiar and comforting. The next day we hunted. We came back empty-handed, but it didn't matter. It was all about the experience. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Danny said, "Let's check the cameras, see if we caught anything interesting." I grabbed my laptop and we went to retrieve the first one. It was strapped to an old oak tree overlooking a narrow game trail. I pulled the memory card and plugged it into the laptop. We both leaned in, eager to see what we'd captured. The first few photos were from the daytime. A couple of squirrels, a fox that seemed to be staring suspiciously at the camera. Then came the nighttime shots, grainy and black and white in the infrared light. A pair of does came to drink. Everything was normal. Then an image popped up that made us both freeze. It was a picture of us. Taken at around 2 a.m., the photo showed Danny and me asleep in our tent, our sleeping bags clearly visible. But the angle was all wrong. This wasn't taken from the tree where I'd mounted the camera. This was taken from low to the ground, from behind a bush, as if someone were hiding, spying on our tent. "What is this?" Danny whispered. "Did you put the camera here?" "No," I said, my heart starting to pound. "I put it on the tree 6 feet up." We clicked to the next photo. Same scene a few minutes later. Then the next, and the next. For 20 minutes, every 2 minutes, the camera had taken a picture of our tent. "Maybe it fell," I said, trying to rationalize it, but I knew I was lying to myself. The cameras were strapped on tight. They don't just fall and reposition themselves. We decided to check the second camera. This one was near a small creek. Its footage was even more disturbing. At first, it was normal. But just after midnight, the camera's angle abruptly changed. It was no longer pointed at the creek. It was aimed directly at our campsite, at the fire pit where we had been sitting just hours before. And then we saw him. A figure. A tall, thin man stood at the edge of the frame, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. His face was obscured, but he was staring directly at our camp. In the next photo, he had moved a few steps closer. In the one after that, he was standing by our table, looking down at our gear. In one shot, he reached out and picked up my hunting knife, which I'd carelessly left on the table. He turned it over in the moonlight, examining it before placing it back down. He was in our camp, while we were sleeping just a few yards away. "Sam, who is that?" Danny's voice was tight with fear. "I don't know," I said, my eyes glued to the screen. We checked the third camera. This one was the furthest from our camp, overlooking a clearing. Its footage turned our fear into pure terror. This camera had also been moved. It was now aimed directly at the entrance of our tent from a distance of no more than 10 feet. The footage showed the same man. At 3 a.m., he was standing right in front of our tent. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there as if listening to us breathe. He stood there for almost an hour. An hour. He was so close that if either of us had shifted in our sleep, he would have heard it. "We have to get out of here," Danny said, his face pale. "Yeah," I agreed. "Right now." We scrambled to pack, grabbing only the essentials, our phones, wallets, and our rifles. We were ready to leave everything else behind. The sun was setting and we had to get out before dark. As we were throwing our gear into the truck, Danny stopped. "Wait, I didn't finish the footage from the last camera." "Leave it, Danny," I said, my voice sharp. "We need to go." "No, I have to see," he insisted. "I need to know where he went." It was a fatal mistake. We jumped in the truck. I started the engine, the headlights cutting a swath of light into the darkening woods. Danny opened the laptop and plugged in the final memory card. He fast-forwarded through the footage. We saw the man standing in front of our tent, then turning and walking toward the camera. His face was still lost in shadow, but his eyes seemed to glow like two hot pinpricks in the infrared light. He came right up to the camera, and for a moment the screen was just his dark silhouette. Then he picked it up. The footage became a shaky blur as he carried it somewhere else. A few seconds later, he set it down. The new footage made the blood freeze in our veins. The camera was now recording from inside our truck. It had been placed on the back seat, aimed directly at the front seats, the very seats Danny and I were now sitting in. The timestamp on the footage showed it was from only 15 minutes ago. We both froze, the laptop glowing in our laps, illuminating our horrified faces. "Sam," Danny whispered, his voice barely a sound. My mind was screaming. It was impossible. We had locked the truck. How did he get in? How long had he been here? Was he still? Slowly, so slowly, I lifted my eyes from the laptop screen to the rearview mirror. In the back seat, in the darkness, a figure was sitting there. For a heart-stopping moment, time stood still. I could see his eyes glinting in the mirror, reflecting the light from the laptop. He was smiling, the predatory grin of a hunter who has his prey right where he wants it. Before we could scream, before we could even react, the back door flew open. The figure launched himself out of the truck and vanished into the night. It happened so fast our minds couldn't process it. A second later, the terror hit us and we both yelled. I slammed the truck into reverse, turning it so violently the tires screeched in the mud. I floored the accelerator and the truck shot down the logging road. We didn't look back. We just drove, fueled by the primal fear that death was just inches behind us. We drove for an hour until we hit pavement and got a single bar of cell service. I called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. A sheriff's deputy met us at a 24-hour diner. We were in shock, barely able to speak. We told him everything and showed him the footage on the laptop. He watched it all in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each frame. He immediately called for backup to be sent to our property. The next few days were a blur. The police scoured every inch of our land. They found our abandoned camp. They found the trail cameras, now smudged with faint, unidentifiable fingerprints. They found a few boot prints in the mud, but they were from a common brand, useless for identification. They found no trace of the man, no campsite, no vehicle, nothing. It was as if he had materialized from the forest itself and then vanished back into it. The sheriff's theory was that he was a deranged local, a squatter who considered our land his own territory. But during the investigation, something else came to light, something that turned our horror story into a nightmare with much deeper, darker implications. When the FBI's cybercrime unit analyzed our laptop and the memory cards, they found a file we had missed. On the last card, after the video from inside our truck, he had left a small text file. It contained a single line of text. Phase 3. Extraction, targets acquired, awaiting signal. Below the text was a strange symbol and a link to a website that didn't exist on the regular internet. It was a dark web address. This changed everything. This wasn't a lone madman. This was an organized operation. The FBI's theory was that this man was a spotter for a group that abducted people for a live-streamed human hunt on the dark web, where wealthy clients paid to watch. He wasn't just trying to scare us. He was marking us, He was studying our routines, our fears, our vulnerabilities. He was psychologically breaking us down so that when the time came for extraction, we would be easy prey. The trail cameras weren't just a game. They were his surveillance tools. He put the last camera in the truck because he wanted us to see it. He wanted us to experience that final, heart-stopping moment of terror, to know that he was with us in our last safe space. It was the final, cruel act of the hunt, letting the prey know it's been caught. The FBI took over the case. They tried to track the dark website, but it was a ghost. It would appear for a few days, then vanish. They never found a trace of the group or the man who hunted us. We never set foot on that land again. My father sold it the following year. We never found out who he was or what that group was. But to this day, whenever I get into a car, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a smiling face in the darkness. That man didn't just take our land from us, he took our sense of safety. And that's a kind of fear no camera can ever capture. We weren't just two brothers on a hunting trip. We were pawns in a game whose rules we never understood, and we were just lucky we managed to get off the board before the game was over. My name is Clara. When my grandmother passed, she left me her old house in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, a world away from the hustle of my corporate job and cramped city apartment. It was a place where time seemed to have slowed to a crawl, a small, weathered farmhouse surrounded by lush, overgrown fields and dense woods. For me, it was a chance to start over, to breathe, to be closer to the memory of the woman who raised me. The house was old, with floors that groaned under every step and wallpaper that had faded to a pale yellow, but it had a strange, comforting peace. My only neighbor was Mr. Abernathy, an elderly, quiet man who lived alone in a similar old farmhouse across the road. He was one of those men who seemed to have grown out of the land itself, his silence as deep and ancient as the surrounding forest. The first few weeks were idyllic. I cleaned the house, tended to the overgrown garden, and spent my evenings on the porch swing, reading my grandmother's old books. I rarely saw Mr. Abernathy. He'd occasionally drive by in his rusted pickup truck or be a distant figure working in his fields. He'd always offer a curt nod but never stop to chat. There was a sadness in his eyes, a distance that made him feel like he was living in another world entirely. Between my property and his, right on the boundary line, sat an old stone well. It was covered with a heavy, rotting wooden lid and choked with weeds and vines. It had clearly been out of use for decades. It always drew my eye as if it were hiding some long-forgotten secret. One afternoon, while I was walking the perimeter of my land, I found myself drawn to it. I reached out to touch the lid, curious to see if I could move it. "Stay away from that." The voice was harsh and gravelly, startling me. Mr. Abernathy was standing on the other side of the fence, holding a rusty hoe. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were cold and hard. "Oh, I'm sorry," I stammered. "I was just looking." "Some things are best left unseen," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That well isn't safe. Don't go near it." It was a command, not a suggestion. He then turned and went back to his work as if the conversation had never happened. His reaction unsettled me. What danger could an old, abandoned well possibly hold? But I complied. I was new here and didn't want to start trouble with my only neighbor. But I couldn't stop thinking about that well. A few weeks later, for my own peace of mind, I installed a few security cameras around the house. It was a remote area and living alone felt a little vulnerable. The cameras were motion activated and sent alerts to my phone. One night at around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected. I opened the feed. It was from the camera aimed at the back of the property, the one that covered the well. In the pale moonlight, I saw Mr. Abernathy. He was standing by the well. He carefully slid the heavy lid aside. Then he lifted a burlap sack he had slung over his shoulder and dropped it into the dark depths of the well. Afterward, he replaced the lid and silently walked back to his own property. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. What was he throwing into the well in the middle of the night? Was he just dumping trash? But why be so secretive about it? For the next few nights, I stayed awake, watching the camera feed. Nothing. Then, a week later, it happened again. Just after midnight, Mr. Abernathy appeared. This time, he was carrying a small, heavy-looking box. He dropped it into the well and disappeared. Now I knew something was deeply wrong. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my elderly neighbor was dumping trash in a well. They'd think I was crazy. I decided I had to investigate myself. The next day, when I saw Mr. Abernathy drive off in his truck toward town, I knew it was my chance. I grabbed a crowbar and headed for the well, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lid was incredibly heavy. It took all my strength to pry it open. When it finally moved, a wave of cold, damp, and foul-smelling air rose from the depths. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it down into the darkness. The well was deep, and I could see the surface of the water far below. But floating on the surface were several objects. I got a long rope, tied a hook to the end, and lowered it down. After several attempts, I pulled up the first item. It was an old leather wallet caked in mud and slime. When I opened it, I found an ID card inside. It belonged to a young woman named Emily Davis, who was smiling in her photo. My blood ran cold. I lowered the hook again. This time, I pulled up a man's watch, its glass shattered, its hands frozen in time. Then came a shoe, a small child's sneaker. I pulled up nearly a dozen items, each one clearly belonging to a different person. This wasn't trash, these were trophies, mementos. I realized who Mr. Abernathy was. He wasn't just a quiet, eccentric old man. He was a monster, a predator who was collecting souvenirs from his victims and hiding them in this well. I immediately called 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator everything. The police arrived within minutes. They sealed off the scene and called in the detectives. When they raided Mr. Abernathy's house, he was sitting on his porch, as if he had been waiting for them. He offered no resistance. The investigation uncovered a story more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Abernathy, whose real name was Arthur Leach, had been a serial killer for the past 40 years. He preyed on travelers, runaways, and people who wouldn't be missed right away. He would murder them and dispose of their bodies in various locations across the state, where they would never be found. But he always kept one thing from each victim: a wallet, a watch, a ring, a shoe. These were his trophies, his proof of conquest. And he would drop these mementos into the well, which was technically not on his property, so that if he were ever caught, no evidence would be found in his home. The well was his secret treasure chest, a silent witness to his sins. The police recovered items belonging to dozens of missing persons from the well. Emily Davis, whose wallet I had found, was a college student who had disappeared 10 years ago. The watch belonged to a man who had vanished 15 years prior. The child's sneaker belonged to a little boy whose family had been passing through the area 20 years ago and were never seen again. Arthur Leach never confessed to his crimes, but the evidence was undeniable. He was sentenced to life in prison. I sold the house and left that place for good. I couldn't live in a silence that was filled with so many secrets and so much pain. Sometimes I still think about that well, a place that was between two properties belonging to neither. A place where a man buried his sins for 40 years thinking they would be safe forever. I was lucky that I uncovered his secret, but I also know that if I hadn't installed those cameras, Arthur Leach would still be sitting on his porch, and that well would still be waiting for more mementos.